death of someone close to you is always life-changing, often weakening, but not always. Sometimes it can prompt healing, growth. I'm Timothy Giles. This is At a Loss, a podcast about life and death. Today in conversation with Kevin Toolis. He was a war correspondent, death surrounding his daily work, which over the years deadened him emotionally and spiritually until returning home to be with his dying father in remote rural Ireland, into a community that gathered around him to share in the dying and then in the grieving at his father's wake. From that experience, he's written 2 books and has toured the world. Right now, he's in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to share the healing, the learning, the life-changing experiences from his father's wake. Kevin, I'm really interested about the mission. Read your books, My Father's Wake, 9 Rules to Conquer Death. Your experience as a war journalist, as a documentarian, as a creative writer and a producer of creative projects. Now, you'd been exposed to an awful lot, and I'm just wondering, this mission that you're on now, what are you actually up to? What are you looking to achieve, traveling the world as you are and talking on the topics that you do?
I think it's pretty basic, really. I encountered, you might call it a moment of epiphany with my father's wake. And I realized that people in the village sort of cradling this man to death, that this was very sort of powerful, basic human kindness, obviously very powerful emotions, that people were giving of themselves, a living presence to help someone leave the world. The moment I'm describing is where my father was very close to death, and then local people were in the room, more of a kind of open rite within an Irish clan, and the sort of private death that you'd expect in the kind of Western world. And that they were following really an ancient ritual. It was an act of kindness, an act of grace. There's a reason why our ancestors practiced things like the tangi and the Irish wake, a whole series of obligations between the living and the dead. But they're profoundly therapeutic. And we sort of lose them at our peril. In the modern way of death, the way that I call the Western death machine, commercial interests and a lack of communal ownership of death means that we often hand death over to the professionals. And it's not knocking undertakers and people involved in the industry. There's many, many good people work in that industry. But often actually the needs, the emotional needs, physical needs, sometimes the financial needs of the bereaved very much comes second place. And, it's understandable that the logic of commercial organisation is not geared towards the individual psychological needs of a family. But I think we should really reclaim these ancient rights, a bit like sort of natural birth. We are empowered to do what we want with the how the deaths of our bereaved are actually managed, how they're conducted, how they're dealt with.
Kevin, you've talked about 2 things there of people being helped. The family, which I'd like to come to in a moment, but the one that caught my attention is you sort of helping someone to die. How?
Well, the first and most important really lesson is the way that you learn to help people to die is for you to have experience of a communal death rite, throughout your own life. So my father, Sonny, who was a very ordinary man who lived most of his life in the UK, but was born on Achill Island in County Mayo, where all my family are from.
Now, I've looked that up. It's pretty remote.
It's pretty remote, yeah. So Sonny returned, in retirement after my mother died to Achill Island. And he's a very physically powerful man. So he's very active, even in his 70s. And then he got pancreatic cancer. And, pancreatic cancer is one of these very serious cancers with about a 5% survival rate after 10 years. I mean, it's pretty fatal. And as he died on the island, he was sort of enveloped in the rites of the Irish wake. He had a very traditional Irish wake. He even had a very traditional pre-Irish wake where lots of people, some of them almost strangers, came to see him to say goodbye as he was dying. And just to be clear, an Irish wake is not the drinks party that you have after the funeral. An Irish wake is where the living share company with the time of the dead. The dead are in a kind of coffin, usually in an open coffin in the sitting room at home, for 2 days. Lots of people come to the house to pay their respects, to offer their condolences to the family. There's a bit of drink, there's food, there's lots and lots of conversations. It's I wouldn't call it a wedding feast, but there is, huge amounts of human activity around the body of the deceased. Lots of people visiting, and lots of stories being told about the deceased, the connections they had in their community. Lots of connections between people in the community who actually meet up at the wake. So it's also a sort of ancient rite that you can actually see dates back well beyond the Iliad, the ancient Greek war poem written about the fall of Troy in 750. There are descriptions of a wake in the Iliad that could be taking place in Ireland today. Now, the value of all of this is that it really kind of inducts a younger generation and the current generation into having this experience of a communal death rite. Death is not just for old people and a few friends to turn up, 10 of them at some sort of funeral. Death is something that children go to, teenagers go to, houses are filled. It's a bit like sort of inoculation. You get a little bit of experience of what death is like. What do the dead people look like? What's literally, you touch the bodies of the dead. So death becomes very familiar, not a once in a generation event, but a sort of every other day occurrence. And if you're in Ireland, it is incredible. I often do this in my lectures. I ask people to take up their right hand and count off the number of corpses they have seen, touched, kissed, and embraced. And will that count make it to your left hand? If I was asking that question in Ireland, people would probably come answer of hundreds. You can go to a small Irish town on a sort of Friday evening at 6 o'clock, and you can find 300 or 400 people queuing outside a funeral home, what they call like a visitation, where the body's lying in the coffin. Those people are queuing up. They have these special black traffic cones in Ireland, that are saying funeral taking place, and there's queues of traffic. So death is much more interweaving into ordinary life. And the value of this is, of course, even if you deny death, even if you shun death, even if you don't want to talk about it, death is interwoven into ordinary life across the world. We die at roughly 1% a year. So all you need to do is take the population of the town that you live in, divide it by 100, and you have got the annual death toll last year, this year, next year, and the year beyond. And the question I put to your listeners is, how many of them do you know in your town? You must know some of them, because each of those dead people have brothers and sisters and families and children and grandchildren. So the ripple of that death, like a stone in a pond, it sort of reflects out. So it's not just 1%, it's maybe 10% of the population, 15 each and every year, are affected by the loss of someone in the family somewhere every year. But would we know that was taking place?
You talked about it. I like the image of inoculation, and that gradually, as a child and then as you grow and mature, one is more and more exposed, and then you can get from it being as natural as birth to a natural death. Got that. But that wasn't how it was for you, right? Like, you didn't grow up in that small, close-knit, rural community. You came home for your father's wake, and this was not entirely familiar for you, right?
I mean, so my family, my father and mother really lived in exile from Achill Island for most of their lives. They lived in the UK, but we regularly returned every summer. So my mother actually took me to my first wake when I was 7 years old. And I was sort of familiar. As a teenager, we actually used to go to the wake for the crack, as we called it. So we had sort of dating games. And this was a sort of usurpation of mortality.
Sorry, hang on. Hang on. Just as a teenager, you're on a date and you are going into the sitting room of a home of a person who is dead in their coffin, and you're there on a date.
Yeah, your wake games first appear actually as funeral games in the Iliad, written in 750. And from those funeral games, which were in celebration by Achilles, they sort of marked the death of his lover Patroclus. Wake games actually evolved into the gladiatorial games in Rome. So when you look at Russell Crowe, the gladiator, you're actually looking at an ancient Trojan, Grecian funereal tradition. Wake games then continued on in a sort of ancient, mythic psychodrama at sort of funerals. And what really wake games are is a sort of usurpation of mortality, is where there's usually a jester figure. In Irish, it's called a kind of burricking, a male, who sort of plays the Lord of Misrule, where you're at the wake and he sort of encourages libidinous behavior. It's a sort of, you can almost think of it as some sort of ancient psychodrama, where in the face of death, they're in sort of encouraging sexual congress, flirtation, a mockery of death. So as a teenager, when we went to the wake, we were like, after the dance, we'd be ravenously hungry. We'd go there, sort of fill up on ham and tomato sandwiches. Cigarettes would be being passed around, and some of my companions would filch a couple off the plate. And then we played a sort of dating game called The Button, which was really a bit like spin the bottle. You were trying to really hook up with one of the opposite sex. And it was sort of trying to guess who had the button. And you played it like a sort of forfeit game. And if a girl got it wrong, then the burriki and the jester got her to go outside with another boy, or you had to kind of tickle the ear of an old man. Now, it may not sound particularly reverent, but in a way it was also, in a very, very ancient way, sort of teaching the young, grab at life now. Don't, seize the moment. This is your life. You're going to end up like the dead guy. These would normally be sort of wakes that would take place of sort of old people, where it was no sort of great tragedy. But wakes were also a bit of, like a gathering. There was kind of food. You got to socially meet the kind of opposite sex. So there was a bit of sort of flirtation. There was life in death. And now you might think it a bit strange, a bit kind of off-putting and stuff. But when you think about it, it's really a sort of profoundly old human message that life goes on. And, speaking to people, an awful lot of children are born subsequent to a sort of funeral and loss. And in the Iliad, it's quite interesting that Achilles' mother, Thetis, advises him to have more sex as a form of grief therapy.
As a form of grief therapy?
Yeah. advice which I think, speaking from personal experience, can do a grieving soul a world of good.
Mockery of death stands out for me in that conversation. And I'm wondering, though, at the same time, the family who are the most bereaved, the most affected, have they just become caterers for the community at this point?
You see, I think death comes in many shapes and forms. And sometimes, if someone is old and, they've been kind of ill, we should sort of recognize the kind of sophisticated response. Sometimes, as people often say, it's a blessing for them. And they also mean it's a blessing for themselves too. So not all deaths clearly are tragic. And I'm not saying that, if it was a sort of tragic death where people have died, or it's like a young person, or, it's particularly emotional and rupture, then you would have sort of less of these sort of weight games. But, we live, breathe, and die, and human beings obviously have practiced various sort of funereal rites for a long time. I think, in a way, going back to it, with these weight games, again, it was another sort of form of inoculation. Another way that we said, well, this is part of life too. This is sort of this death. And it's like a sort of container. What better way to teach young people, that life is for grabbing, use the time that you have. These are very existential, ancient lessons. There's a span of a life, different societies, but all human lives come to an end somewhere.
I'll be interested to talk to you. And so, you're traveling Aotearoa and giving talks, right across the country. I'll be interested in, at the end of the month, talking or hearing from you what you've learned and picked up from your time here, because obviously with tangata whenua, with whakaaro Māori, tau Māori, and you mentioned the tangi already, that there is a huge structure around this. And I'm interested also in terms of with the different cultures of the Pacific, the similar things. And I'm curious about that role of the family and the catering thing, and just your experience around this, Kevin, in the Irish context. So I have a friend whose one of his parents died, an elderly parent, and in that particular Pacific Island culture, it's exactly as you describe. The doors are open, 24 hours. There are people through the house, and singing, praying, laughter, lots of food, right? And there were two. All of the beautiful things you've talked about are present. I'm just curious about the management of. He made the decision of, we're only going to open the house between these hours and these hours, which caused quite a bit of controversy in the community, because that's not the way it's done. What he said was, I don't want to be just working to be feeding people from morning till night, and we need some time just to draw breath ourselves. And I'm just curious around, like, the roles in the wake. Like, you talked about people coming in with grace and kindness, and in your book you talk about men who come and they do a shift of sitting the night. I'm just wondering about, are there people who come in and take over the kitchen? Is it a 24/7 thing of open doors?
Yeah. The wake is a kind of, if you think about it, is a sort of social ritual, a set of protocols. Now, not every person is going to be comfortable with having a wake. And obviously people are allowed to sort of pick and choose. So like even in Ireland now, you'll often hear house private, and people then, instead of actually having a full wake at the house, they will have basically a visitation, a viewing at the funeral home. They often have a sort of private wake where they then take the body back from the funeral home and have a more private wake at the house where it's just close neighbours and themselves. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult to read what exactly is going on. The main thing to kind of understand is that it's a much more open social ritual. So the Irish don't send out invitations to the wake, and they don't send out invitations to the funeral. They often broadcast. In Mayo, there's a local radio station, Midwest, and it has a daily death column. So it will say, the death has occurred of Nora Kilban, of Knock McGree. She would be reposing at her residence. So that means that the house is open and there's a sort of full wake. Or they might say reposing at a residence between the hours of 7 and 9, or etc. So people kind of pick and choose.
Got it.
Sometimes even the public rituals, it's a bit unclear. Do they actually mean that there are no visitors? And sometimes, it's a bit of like you have to go and see. But what the Irish are in general is they're much less inhibited about going to a funeral, going to the house of someone bereaved, meeting the bereaved in like the local supermarket, and then they shake their hands and tell them that they're sorry for the condolences. All of these death rituals take place in a society that's much more open and accepting. Now, you're talking about like the sort of cost of these things. And sometimes this was, it was an old-fashioned ritual, and a bit like other societies, like big weddings and funerals, they do cost money. And, sometimes people are sort of poor, and it's a great kind of burden. People are still free to choose. It's not sort of like an iron cast model. You can do this. What I think what's the significant difference is the sort of less shame around deaths, less closure. It's much, much more open. People do, turn up at the house, pay their condolences. It could be like a cup of tea and a ham sandwich. So it doesn't necessarily, break the bank.
When you talked about I think in both My Father's Wake and in 9 Rules to Conquer Death, you talked about that greeting in the community of sorry for your loss, and that it goes on for some months, and that what is happening there is that people are really saying your person is dead. They're dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the problems again with griefs in the Western world is because funeral events are very small, really unacknowledged, often almost like hidden away, that, the number of people at the funeral who actually turn up at the funeral can just be in, tens. If you're suffering profound grief, your world has completely changed, but the world goes on around you. And that can feel incredibly sort of alienating. How can people keep on doing things when I am suffering so? And there's no public acknowledgement of that. We don't have, for instance, as the Victorians had, they had like, protocols of mourning, and women wore black for 3 years, or men had a black armband. And we could see that this person was undergoing some sort of change state. We could react to them, show our respect by saying, I'm sorry. So it's like we're kind of in camouflage, we're in sort of civvies, and yet those amongst us who are grieving are suffering. With the Irish, they're under a social obligation to acknowledge your loss the first time that they see you. So they actually go out of their way to make sure that they shake your hand and say, look, I'm really sorry about the death of your father, even if this is 3 months or 6 months afterwards. It's the reverse of the sort of Western protocol of denial, that they're actually under this obligation to actually mark it out so it's passed and acknowledged. And that obviously does, for the bereaved, at least tell them that people do recognise this social change. It's also, I think, a way of reinforcing that the dead person is not coming back. You're constantly reminded. One of the problems about that isolation and alienation of this individual grief, unacknowledged, is this sort of almost fantasy that Joan Didion talks about, the year of magical thinking, where she couldn't throw out her husband's shoes in case he needed them again. She couldn't clear out his clothes. And because he might be returning. And although it's a mad thing, as she says, magical thinking, it was one that profoundly affected her psychologically.
And it's a really common story. I guess there's two questions around that, Kevin. One is, in that context, it's people coming up to you who may not know you well, right? And may not have known your father well,
Yeah.
right? But are aware of just you in the community. And I'm coming across and breaking across that social exclusion and acknowledging that loss, correct? Like it's anybody. That's the social obligation. That's the etiquette.
You see, that it can be a bit of an uncomfortable experience. And you said, what was it like going home? So I was a bit in two worlds. I grew up in a large city, Edinburgh, and then my family have roots, and I live on Achill Island now. So I was in between two places, and it can feel, you think, oh goodness, who are these people doing this? With sort of intrusion. But you either do death as some sort of private shaming event in which we never talk about it and it's sort of hidden away, or else you have death, which is much more open and people acknowledge it. And so strangers come up to you in the supermarket and say, I'm really so sorry to hear about your father. Which do we choose? Which is psychologically better? Death continues on at the same rate, 1% all around us. Death doesn't change. It's our attitudes and what's healthy for us. And I would argue, and really, if you said, what's the mission? I would argue that we don't have to accept everything that the Irish do around death, but they do some things very well. So we can use the Irish protocol of death, the Irish wake. We can take the best elements and adapt it for our own usage. Because I definitely do know that the reverse of death denial, death shaming, death silence is psychologically warping, very, very painful, and I think profoundly traumatic.
And lonely. And look, you've mentioned the word trauma in there. And I'm curious, Kevin, on your thinking around this almost universal acknowledgement and that constancy and of saying to someone, right, you're not in camouflage. I can see your wound, your pain, your suffering. You're trying to adapt to reintegrate into this context of what you've lost, versus I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to trigger anything.
See, again, I think you go back to the wisdom of our ancestors, and what you're really talking about is the pleasures of sorrow. So in the Iliad, after Patroclus has been killed and his body's been taken back to the Greek camp, Achilles, who's man-slaying Achilles, the sort of warrior, fearsome killer, he lays Patroclus's body on the beach, and then he gets his soldiers, his Myrmidons, to ride round Patroclus's body until they have their fill of the pleasures of sorrow. And that means keening and weeping and wailing. And Homer says that the breastplates of the warriors were wet with tears. It's very interesting that in this ancient Greek tradition, warriors, men, some of the most frightening human beings that you could ever meet, actually openly keen and grieve. It's a really sort of profound phrase, actually. Achilles is, until we have our fill of the pleasures of sorrow. And by what that he means by that is this sort of cathartic, this weeping and wailing, this getting out of this emotion. And I've known it through my own father's wake. You get your emotion out, it comes in waves, overwhelms you, but gradually it becomes less and less and less. So we shouldn't be afraid of the pleasures of sorrow. Sad is not bad. If I walk up to you and maybe trigger you, by sort of shaking hand and reminding you, it's probably because you're in a profound state of grief. I'm not making you more sad. I'm actually acknowledging that you are sad. I'm actually helping you, pulling you out of the well of sadness that you're in because you've lost someone that you've loved.
Thank you. The word keening, Kevin. I, in my mind, I'm thinking of the wailing of voices of women, but you're talking about men. What's a male keening?
There is male keening, and it often can be a bit more sort of formal, like a kind of song. But also, that you can cry out loud. It's not unmanly to cry. It's not unmanly to show emotion for someone that you've lost. I mean, it's really interesting that big boys don't cry, but the reverse with the Greeks, and to a certain extent with the Irish today, is that big boys do cry. You're allowed, when you've lost someone you love, to cry, and why not? I mean, what is this? It's because again, it's this idea that somehow emotion is dangerous, that will completely lose control. But what you actually see with keening is a kind of controlled release of emotion. It is a moment of obviously great psychological unity when people do keen together. A very sort of powerful wave. You're kind of letting rip. You're getting all that stuff out of you, and actually, it sort of almost like clears the air. It makes you less sad at the end of it.
Okay, that unity, I get it. You said it's as if emotion is dangerous. Emotion is dangerous, Kevin. Like, we do lose it. People talk to me so often around a funeral and saying, I'd love to say something, but I don't want to lose it. We do find emotion dangerous. It is dangerous, Kevin.
Well, dangerous too. I mean, you're allowed to. I've been at funerals where people have wept. I've been in funerals in Israel where a whole wave of emotion has swept through the crowd, and men surrounding me with M16 guns have begun to cry. I don't think it's about losing it. I think it's about showing that you are emotionally affected. And, that's why we have movies and books, and part of our culture is about, obviously, powerful emotions, heroism, loss. I'm not afraid of emotion, and we shouldn't be afraid of emotion. It's rather the reverse. I would be afraid of repression, of bottling it up. And I've been to funeral orations where people have cried and they've broken down as they've spoken on the altar. And I think that's commendable rather than being a moment of weakness.
What are you commending?
Sorry, I didn't hear you on that one.
What are you commending?
I'm commending actually the courage and the open honesty to stand in front of us and obviously show emotion. Because, of course, that's part of being human.
I'm curious, Kevin, about you talked about men with M16s weeping, and you had a career as a war journalist, and you were habitually around death and actively moving into the places of immediate traumatic loss and grief. Was that a direct line to where you're at now in terms of wanting us to not be afraid of this emotion and to have a communal recognition of the wound of loss of someone?
In a sort of convoluted way, yes. I mean, one of the things I learned from going to all these places of famine and war and plague, but then the healing process really was when I returned to the island and through my father's wake. And just a small example is there aren't any professional pallbearers on the island, and there are no professional grave diggers. So it's just a squad of volunteer local men who dig the grave, and they dig the grave by hand. So there's a kind of chief grave digger. And the last sort of command, the last obligation between the living and the dead is when the coffin is carried up the mountain, and then it's usually laid over the grave on sort of 3 wooden posts. And then the pallbearers get ready, they surround the coffin, and the gravedigger says to the pallbearers, he says, like, take the weight. And then usually 6 men, 3 on each side of the coffin, they lift up the coffin on ropes. These wooden posts are pulled out, and then they slowly together in unison lower the coffin down. The profound metaphor of that really is that the best way of dealing with our mortality is for us communally to take the weight. You can't lower a coffin down to the grave by yourself. You can't bear the burden of loss all by yourself. That burden, if it can be shared communally, in all different degrees, from family members to community members, you lessen the burden, you complete the task. It's a much more humane, ancient and therapeutic way of dealing with it. And I'd say that in my sort of lectures, that remember to try and help take the weight of others' mortality. To be truly human is to bear the burden of your own mortality and reach out and strive in grace to help others carry theirs, sometimes lightly and sometimes courageously.
Because those waves you spoke about before will come and will pass. And if I know that, I can be in your company even whilst one of those waves has you gripped in it.
Say that again, sorry?
Well, that emotion, right? The taking the weight, the emotion that I am scared and uncomfortable of someone else's extreme grief, right? But what you're saying is, with my familiar, as I'm listening to you, I'm familiar that this grief will come in a wave, but the waves will pass. And
yes, and by taking the weight, that can mean going to visit the sick, spending time in their company. They might want to talk about their illnesses, or they might want to talk about the football. People somehow shun the sick and say, "Oh my goodness, what could we possibly talk about?" The other thing is that you can share your death. My father shared his death. He was quite open. He acknowledged his death, but he shared his death with the community, and the community shared his death with him. There was no sort of denial that he was dying. I mean, he was just another man dying. There's nothing strange and unusual about that. But it was openly acknowledged. Children were part of the process. They sort of came round, they were playing at the bottom of his coffin. The house was full. They probably saw their first, the youngest ones saw their first dead body. It was constantly sort of interknitted as one common event after the other. People came round, shared company, helped do things. The local bar owner lent us bar stools. Family members came round to take part in the vigil. It's not something that you could even do as a family. So Sonny was like never left alone when he was dying. There was always someone there with him. So it was a task that was shared, a burden that was shared in countless different ways. People went to get flowers. Obviously his children came from all parts of the world, to see him as he was dying and to be at his funeral. People gave up their time to actually go to the funeral. So there were like hundreds of people there. So that's what I mean by sharing the burden, is that participating in this sort of process, maybe if it's only 10 minutes, maybe it's sort of an hour. It's not all about like potluck dinner. It's about doing something small, some acknowledgement, and giving of your own living presence. Because with the dead and dying, we cannot write out a check. We cannot, reverse the reality that these people are dying. Our power and status, it doesn't mean anything other as well. Thank God that billionaires die too. Otherwise, we'd be living under a new kind of Stalinist internet regime forever.
We almost are. It struck me in my father's wake in that book that you've talked about someone being always with Sonny, always with Dad as he's dying, but also when he was near death and death was imminent, there was a calling in, come, he's about to die. And the room filled. And a number of times he didn't. And it's like, oh, okay, moved out. But that was important to have people around Sonny at his moment of passing.
Yeah, it's common in religions. People talk about it as a kind of blessing. That's what they talk about in Judaism. You know, it is a moment of existential transformation. You know, it can be a bit mixed. People can be, to be blunt about it, sort of excited. You know, they're experiencing something. They can be obviously a bit fearful. So what happened with Sonny is that we thought he was dying at that moment. And then we all sang this sort of prayer, you know, the Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of their death. It really was like an Irish Catholic Buddhist chant, a mantra, something that you've learned as a Catholic child, you know, from the ages of 4. You can say it in your sleep. But we were actually, in a very profound way, cradling Sonny into death so that the last sound that he would ever hear would be this familiar lullaby. Okay. But it was also like a rope, something to hold on to as we sort of moved our way through Sonny's death. Now, he didn't die at that exact moment. He died a bit just before dawn on the longest day in a bit more private moment, with my sister, my brother in the room with him. But again, it is a sort of giving. It was an act of grace that relative strangers, community friends, were helping this man in his passage out. And I often say that if the first best hope of life is that you will be born into a community who love you, then the last best hope of life is that you will die within a community who love you. And what can be more loving than praying as someone is dying as they're leaving this world?
I love that you describe it as a multi-religious, multi-denominational, even the pagan element there of the chant and prayer combined. The death, though, was not the end of the process. And it interests me that children were encouraged to kiss, greet, caress, and friends would come in and caress your father after death. And so this is the wake. The person has died, their body, their corpse is now there, but he is caressed, he's spoken to, he's embraced and talked to still.
Yes, it's sharing time with the company of the dead. And without being too philosophical at this time in the morning, it remains the epicenter of our entire civilization. Because in that moment of encounter between the living us and the dead them, that's the moment which has spawned our eternal quest for eternal life. And every religion, holy book, temple, synagogue, mosque, every prophet, every edict about religious edict about the so-called frailty of women, usually by men, male misogynists, obviously. Every jar of face cream, vitamin pill, the movie industry, and unfortunately, the deaths of millions of other human beings who failed to believe, you know, heretics and pagans, in our particular version of a deathless heaven. And that's just that encounter between the sort of corpse and the living. You know, it's this desire not to be dead comes from that sort of moment. And if you think about it, that's what religions are. All religions somehow practice some sort of form of eternal evasion from death. And, so again, I think it's psychologically and existentially very interesting. In terms of like children, well, yeah, because it's part of life too. My mother took me to a wake when I was 7 and told me to touch the body of the dead man. to make me less afraid. And again, it's like a kind of life lesson. And why not? When should you begin? Well, you should begin, take an infant to a sort of funeral. Take a sort of like a toddler. What are you shielding them from? I mean, death is a sort of commonplace. The way to overcome our fear of death is to make it a very ordinary event, rather than a sort of traumatic once in a generation. What do we do now? And you're feeling absolutely hopeless and powerless. You just turn up at an Irish wake, copy what everybody else is doing,
Yes.
Shuffle along in the line of mourners, shake a few hands, sit down, have a cup of tea, maybe a ham sandwich, and just and relax into the process, because it's a pretty common process.
Kevin, thank you so much for this time. And I just want to conclude a little on whether you have a spiritual or a religious belief within that, and this process then from the shared death or the people around, no one dying alone, to the taking of the weight of the internment, or perhaps with cremation these days too, right? That is there a farewelling of a spirit? Do you hold a distinction between the body and the soul?
Well, people have many different forms of sort of religious belief, and I respect that. I'm not a particularly religious person myself. I do understand that part of the mechanism of the wake is to cope with these very normal sort of grieving emotions, psychological trauma, which can affect people who've lost. So it's a very common grief reaction, for instance, for the bereaved to appear in the dreams of the bereaved, for months afterwards, years afterwards. And you can understand why our ancestors thought that this was literally the spirits of the dead returning. And they're very concerned that the spirits of the dead would return and usurp the natural world. And even within the protocols of the Irish Wake, there's lots of what we call rites of reversal, which are really, although you're sort of honouring the dead, you're actually trying to exclude them, bar them from returning to haunt the living. So there's profoundly therapeutic protocols within the Irish Wake, which I think are there regardless of the strength of your religious belief about the spirit world.
So one that you talk about that comes to mind is the coffin is carried out, and this is perhaps on the last journey up the hill to the graveside. The chairs are kicked over.
Yeah. See, that's obviously what an anthropologist would call a rite of reversal. So you're barring the spirit of the dead. They also shake holy water against the side of the house and over the coffin. But really, it's like a supernatural barrier. It's very common, obviously, in all world cultures, being the Maori and across the world, that this notion of the unquiet dead returning to haunt the living. And so, again, the wake is those series, the Changi too, I believe, the series of obligations of the living to the dead, so that the dead rest in peace, and the unquiet dead do not return to haunt us.
I hope that the speaking tour feeds you as much as you have given me in this conversation, never mind the hundreds and thousands that you'll be speaking to over the next wee while, Kevin. Two last questions related more to your broader work. I think, was it Rebel Heart, an earlier book about...
Yeah, it was.
Yeah? Now, do I describe it as being about the Troubles, about IRA? It was like a sort of a documenting of that time, but also you said in that, is that a fair description first, Kevin, or have I missed that?
Yeah. No, it's the full title is Journeys Within the IRA Soul, and it's both a historical and psychological portrait of the kind of motivational beliefs and individuals within the IRA. It's what's really called an archetypal history, where you pick certain characters, chieftains, brothers, to try and explain the history of this sort of conflict. It's a chronicle of the Troubles.
There was, because how long ago did you write that book?
It's nearly 30 years old, and it's still in print, which is a wonderful, wonderful achievement.
Congratulations. There's one more creative initiative of yours that I hope will achieve that success. I want to acknowledge in a moment. But first of all, you made a comment in that book that Ireland has a future, and it is a Republican future, which is what the IRA were working for, fighting for, killing for, right?
Well, it will have a very sort of conditioned, convoluted Republican future.
Yeah, because here we are, 30 years later, right?
Yeah.
It was a bold statement. A statement, it seemed to me, almost of hope that Ireland will have a future and it will be a Republican future, which almost felt unifying as well. Has it arrived?
It's moving in that sort of general direction. I don't think, and I've said this in the book, that the sort of cause of Ireland, the unification of Ireland, is worth killing one person for. The futility of the Troubles was the sort of murder of people for political ideals that furthered their actual implementation. I do think when you look at the sort of long historical pathway, the plantation, the dispossession, the denial, all of this began really with the Elizabethan genocides in Ireland. Ultimately, like in South Africa, you have to come to an accommodation. The fact that Ireland is a relatively small, geographically unitary island, that it would be, you would have something like a unitary state, but still acknowledging the sort of the Britishness of those who wish to obviously retain that. But the division of Ireland is a purely arbitrary political division from the 1920s. It doesn't exist in a kind of geographical, economic reality. It's purely a political reality. It has many downsides, it has a few sort of upsides. It's a bit like the division, like the division of Germany. These things aren't written in stone. They're arbitrary. They may not necessarily be in the best interests of the peoples of Ireland. And I would say that probably a state that recognises the geographical identity of Ireland is probably better in the long run.
Geographical versus political.
Say again?
Geographical versus political. So ignoring that boundary between the dividing boundary. Northern Ireland is a very small. It's not really a country. It's a little statelet. It's sustained by the treasury, the treasures of the British Chancellor of the Exchequer. It has its political flaws. In some ways, what's really happened since the Good Friday Agreement is the existence of a sort of very cold peace, where the lines of conflict, although they're no longer violent, are still sort of frozen. I would sort of see sort of political change. There's obviously demographic change happening in Northern Ireland. There are more Catholics. Literally, the population sort of growing. It's not something that I think people should, labour all their lives for. It will not be a universal good. It might be a better good than the current situation. And certainly, I'd rather see the unification of Ireland than further division within Ireland. And I think slowly, I would say perceptibly, the case for sort of political union is growing. Peaceful, democratic political union. I'm struck by your line, a cold peace. And I'm curious about you coming to Aotearoa, New Zealand, with your Irish experience, and whether that's you've spoken about the genocide from the English on the Irish, and whether you see that as also a many centuries of a colonization or not. But landing here, where I wonder if we have a cold peace, and what as an Irishman you bring, in this, when I say Aotearoa New Zealand, it's for a reason. They're two distinct countries almost, those who live comfortably in Aotearoa and with a love and a celebration of it, either those because they are tangata whenua, people of this land, or the tangata tiriti, and people say that uniting thing you're talking about, or those who claim back to a colonialist past. Do you have at this point a view, a thought of seeing a mirror or something here in exploring this country with your knowledge and view of that?
Well, the main aim is to build a better future. And sometimes you can build a better future by, acknowledging the wrongs of the past. I mean, societies that, like former slave societies, like, South Africa and the southern states of America, and America itself, the level of sort of violence in America, and obviously we can see that in South Africa, is quite shocking in comparison with other societies. But that is a legacy of the oppression and violence of the past. And it doesn't sort of disappear. The legacy of the past doesn't appear. It shapes the future. And what we want to try and do is make sure that whatever that legacy of the past is, we try and get it to shape the future in a positive way. Now, we can do that by acknowledging the wrongs of the past, if that's the proper way forward. Obviously, there's always going to be a political debate. What is the best way around it? But if we stick, obviously, to peaceful democratic means, through recognizing the wrongs of the past, colonization wrongs, through recognizing sort of dispossession. I was in Israel recently, just in January, and obviously there's a sort of whole expansionism within the sort of West Bank where people are being dispossessed in a way that is very similar to sort of what colonists have done in the past. People have been, deprived of their land. Other people have sort of taken over. There's been, lots of quibbling around legalism. This no longer your land, etc. Just as obviously happened with all colonial sort of expansion. Those things just don't disappear. They just carry on into the next generation. They're recipes for further conflict, for further violence, for irresolution. We have a belief in justice and fairness, these things, ideals that we sort of believe in. So it should be fairly obvious that we should be guided by justice and fairness and honesty.
So the last of your creative initiatives I really want to acknowledge and to ask about how it's going is Trump the Musical.
Charlie Chaplin in 1940 had to fund his own film, The Great Dictator. And when he was asked about the film, which obviously was a parody of Hitler, he says, "There is nothing more important than poking fun at pompous people in high places." And I think there's probably no greater mission in the world to poke fun at this ridiculous buffoon who is Donald Trump. I know that might be and get me into some sort of trouble somewhere, but apart from the way that he denigrates the common ideals of the American Republic, even this recent sort of outrage about Robert Mueller, obviously you can see this sort of crypto corruption that's happening all around the sort of Trump family. He is the person that the founding fathers feared, a once in a 200-year phenomenon who does obviously threaten the democratic ideals of the Western world. Is he a figure who should be an object of fun? Yes, I think he should be. So I'm seeking support to put Donald the Trump the Musical on.
Is there a song you could give a taste of, or what, like the?
I can't really, but I'm not such a great singer. But one of the things is that really, if you think about Donald Trump, his core essence is that he's a New York real estate dealer, but there's nothing real about real estate. Real estate ain't real. Think of a price, triple it twice. Real estate goes up and goes down. The main thing is to sell your apartment. And that's what he does. He sells with a vision, a goal. Whether the apartment value falls or whether it rises is immaterial once he's actually managed to, as they say, do you want to be rich or poor? A schmuck who's just blown his luck. So it's all about obviously pressurizing this idea of deals. Also, if you think about it, it's almost like Gaddafi. I think is it more than a couple of months ago, we're talking about the Gaza peace plan, turning Gaza into Abu Dhabi, and this board of peace. It is like the Daily Trump show. Is all these things are put up there. There's a bit of glitter, a bit of sparkle. We've got that one episode, and then we move on to the next episode. And nobody takes into account, are these things real, or are they just sort of figments of the imagination? Do we really think there's going to be a redevelopment plan in Gaza? Or the Board of Peace, who seem to consist of most of these Gulf states, will that exist in the next episode, or is that just thrown behind us?
I really hope that you poke fun at pompous people in important places successfully. The very last thing, Kevin, then, and thank you for all this time, is you started with describing the wake and the communal act, and you used the word grace, and you've used it a number of times, and it's not a word that I hear used very often. Can we close by you defining grace, and then if there's a closing thought or anything that you would like us to end on, I'd love to hear that. So grace is a word you use. What is it?
Well, the best answer to that is I'll end with a piece of bardic poetry. And bardic poetry is a kind of ancient art form, descends from the Iliad. It's a great Irish tradition. And here's a new bardic poem that I've written called If I Could Sing. And I'll sing you a verse. It's all about wakes, but I'll sing you this verse.
Hang on, bardic poems were from the 1600s, weren't they?
There was a bit where Elizabeth I, in January of 1603, she sent an order to Mountjoy, her Governor-General. The Irish barders, rhymers and harpists where found should be hanged and their instruments destroyed. It didn't do the old queen much good because she was then dead by April of 1603. But a few bardic poets clearly sort of survived. And here's a new bardic poem, I say, called If I Could Sing. If you could hear my song, you too would listen in rapture to the Imrokinshire, keening women, crying out, heart struck still for Hector and his children, sundered in the same grieving, that the living and the dying must commingle in the sickening, the dying and the grave. Ancient and new and eternal chorus, mourners, keeners, pilgrims at the wake. Bound to in sure belief that in this unselfish giving to the dead, that newborn sons and daughters will spring from the lamenting wombs of the pulsating living. No, if I could sing, I would never sing of the fallen city of Ilium and glories gone, but of my mother's island, far out to the west, rising, sea-plucked, spray-lashed, a citadel of stone, walled deep in the blue ocean, where the last best hope of humanity beats on, that mortal being incarnate in flesh shall not live, love, or die alone. And if I could sing, if we could sing together, my brothers and sisters, surely then we would never stop the singing of this song.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate all the time you've given me. That's a wonderful conversation.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
more than okay. Look, and I really hope that you are fed and, that you get to go to a tangi and you offer so much. Thank you for that conversation, all of the unexpected parts around colonisation and your grace, Kevin. I look forward to meeting you in a few weeks.
Okay, good. Take
Thanks.
care. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye. If you hear this recording in time, in March, April of 2026, then do catch Kevin on his tour around Aotearoa. And in fact, his very last event I'll be doing out at Morrison's in Henderson, but it'll also be live and online. Giles at @aloss.nz if you'd like details about that. And also if you've got any feedback on this, other episodes, or thoughts on what we should cover, that's Giles at @aloss.nz.